Hello, and welcome to Test Pattern. This is my new series, I guess, where I talk about how ideas are communicated through media. By now, I'm sure you've all seen Gillette's "We Believe the Best Men Can Get" ad. It's by the Grey Agency and Kim Gehrig. Honestly, it feels a lot like an attempt to build brand awareness and sort of showcase Gillette's corporate values. If we're honest, it's probably also just targeted to younger millennials and Gen Z audiences who have been flocking to brands like Dollar Shave Club and Harry's. So, Gillette's market share has taken a pretty huge hit in the last few years, particularly with younger audiences. So the whole campaign seems basically geared towards, recapturing some of the youth. But it turns out it's also going to be one of the most hated videos on YouTube, at least, of probably of all time. It's got over 1 million dislikes already, which is double the number of likes that it has. For comparison, this is pretty much going to be on par with Paul Feig's widely panned trailer for the 2016 reboot of Ghostbusters, which has about 1.1 million dislikes to 305,000 likes. So it's the Ghostbusters one is still ahead in terms of the ratio, but overall, this Gillette ad is just getting killed. And if you read the comments, they are 100% negative. For those who haven't seen it, like the video opens with an audio montage featuring words like bullying and toxic masculinity, Me Too, and it depicts men behaving really, really badly in present day tense and throughout modern history, like basically the 1950s on. But of course, it's also trying to be inspiring. So as the ad progresses, it depicts other scenarios where men are seen to be stopping these bad behaviors. So we've got like the bad guys and the sort of, hero guys. To my mind, it's using a technique that presentation expert Nancy Duarte calls threaded storytelling. She's written a bunch of books about this, but she spent some time analyzing some of the greatest oratory speeches in history, like, the Gettysburg Address and Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. And she found that a lot of them build on ideas and retain audience interest by alternating descriptions of the author's vision of the world as it is with their vision of the world like as it could be. So using Martin Luther King as an example, like the I Have a Dream speech is a really good case study. So where Martin Luther King says, here's how the world is. People are not judging each other by the content of their character, but they are, judging each other by their skin color. They're racist and being bigoted, and they're causing all these problems. But I have a dream that we could one day live in a world where that doesn't happen anymore. That's basically how the Gillette ad is framed. So, for example, it shows a scene where kind of like a 1950s, well, really maybe like 1980s sitcom. It's showing the lead actor grabbing the butt of the lead actress, and it's very like sort of chauvinistic joke. And then it cuts back to that audience not laughing anymore. Like this is how the world is or has been up until now. But the new audience, the non-laughing audience, that's the audience that we want, right? Then it shows a bunch of examples of like bullying. And again, that's, this is how men are and have been for a long time. And then it shows good men. It shows men stepping in to fight this bad behavior. And it literally uses the words, toxic masculinity. So the whole thing is structured like this. So you see the world as it is, at least through the eyes of the creators. And then you see the world as they'd like it to be, which is pretty explicitly what they would describe as a world without toxic masculinity. And so they also show a couple of real-world examples, too, like Terry Crews talking to Congress about bullying and child abuse and stuff like that. And the thing is, on the surface, the ad is fundamentally highlighting really just a number of pretty much universally objectionable behaviors, like sexual assaults and sexual harassment and, other kinds of abusive and aggressive violent behaviors. And then it literally asks at the end of the ad, is this the best a man can get? Which is, a play on Gillette's classic slogan, the best a man can get. So we see what they're doing, right? Like, so they're trying to essentially create a brand awareness campaign that is aligning Gillette's brand to this idea of a kinder world, a world where men are nicer and, better to each other and better to women. And if you never really look at the framing or the subtext of the spot, you really won't find a whole lot to disagree with, right? Like nobody really disagrees with the idea that people shouldn't beat each other up. But again, this video is being panned by the internet hard, right? So this has all left a number of my Facebook friends to ask, like, how it's even possible that a lot of people could dislike the video. The working theory that a lot of people seem to be expressing is the idea that we just live in a world where a ton of men are like actually these abusers, and they love being abusers, and they feel attacked by the ad because they want to continue to be abusers. But I think that this is entirely wrong, and I think I have an answer to why people don't like the ad. And it all starts with this idea of a sort of a Mott and Bailey argumentation tactic. This is a sort of a form of rhetoric that it's really a rhetorical metaphor, let's call it, for a medieval kind of siege tactic. And look, I'm no expert on medieval siege tactics, but essentially the idea is that you have a really fortified position. In the terms of the metaphor, you have a really strong argument. And that argument is it's bad to bully people, or it's wrong to abuse women. Sexual harassment is bad, right? These are unassailable positions that nobody really disagrees with. You're not going to find a lot of people who defend sexual assault, for example. The Mott is basically like this mound or, sort of hill that the castle rests on. And the hill is fairly well defensible. It's the high ground and whatnot. So that, as far as an argument goes, is essentially a guaranteed winner. But then you have the Bailey, which is farther out and less defensible, and it's a more extreme form of the argument. So it's one thing, for example, to say rape is wrong. Nobody disagrees with that. But it's another thing entirely to say something like all penis in vagina penetration is rape, which is a territory of argument that's been staked out by radical feminists over the years, right? So nobody can really defend that. That's not really a super defensible position. You can't really say that literally every act of intercourse is rape. Nobody's really going to agree with you. However, you can always retreat back to the more fundamental and completely correct argument that rape is wrong. So you can say, hey, all male and female sex is rape, but then when somebody challenges you on that, you get to fall back and say, why do you think rape is a good thing? Well, of course, nobody thinks rape is a good thing. So that's not what's happening. They're challenging the Bailey position. They're challenging the position that's farther out. And so this is really what's happening with the Gillette ad. I think it's a really good example of this kind of argumentation, because if you completely ignore the context and the framing and everything you know about the language that the ad uses, especially at the beginning, and the culture surrounding the themes in the ad, you're not going to find anything particularly objectionable. You're gonna find the Mott all up in there. Like, what's wrong with telling men not to bully each other? Or what's wrong with telling them not to be, terrible to women? Nothing, obviously, right? Like, there's nothing wrong with that. The problem is the language and all of the examples that they're using are actually sort of hallmarks of a set of ideas that go way beyond just those kinds of arguments into what I'm calling the Bailey territory, which is arguments like all men are fundamentally bad. Arguments like toxic masculinity includes roughhousing among little boys, which, by the way, studies routinely and all over the world show is incredibly important for childhood development for especially males, right? Like, actually, it's almost even backwards. Like, studies show that the more dads in particular are involved in rough and tumble play for young boys, the more those boys grow up to be better socialized and less aggressive. And where those boys are either sublimated, they're told not to act in sort of rough and tumble ways, or, where they don't have dads and they don't have good male role models, that's when they become aggressive, right? Like, they don't become aggressive when they roughhouse with each other. So the ad is also staking out that position a little bit too, which is already actually just factually wrong. But the way that the ad does it, I think, is also really instructive. This is a really good example of what I mean when I say there's subtext involved in the ad. If you see that scene, you see a little boy fighting, sort of play fighting. It really, honestly, it really doesn't look that aggressive or bad or whatever. There's two kids wrestling in the grass at a barbecue, and then it says, well, boys will be boys. This is common language used by intersectional feminists, radical feminists, social justice activists, all that kind of stuff, to describe an excuse for bad behavior that supposedly men make for boys and train. This is how they train boys to be bad men, etc. And so then you see that boys will be boys line of one dad who's behind a grill, then another, and then as the frame widens out a little bit, you see just this endless line of men just chanting, boys will be boys, right? Like, I don't think you could get much clearer in expressing the idea that, at least up until now, pretty much all men are bad. Or at least, once again, they are accepting terrible behavior, right? They are making excuses for terrible behavior. They're refusing to step in. That's the Bailey, right? Like, the Bailey is stuff like pretty much any and all typically traditionally masculine behavior is bad. Men are, generally speaking, sexual predators and abusers. Men are, generally speaking, abusive bullies. That's what men are, and that's what men have been. You know, this ad sort of stakes out a position from basically the 1950s to today. But then, of course, it shows all these examples of good men standing up. So as I've been having conversations with people, it's been weird because they go, well, hey, the ad couldn't possibly be saying that all men are bad because it shows all these examples of good men. But the problem is that's all aspirational, right? That's what the ad is showing that they want men to be like. But they're saying those are the minority. These good men are rare, but we want them to not be rare. We want them to be everywhere. And all of this, I think, is ultimately kind of a rhetorical trick, because if you're standing at the Bailey area where you're saying all men are bad, like, you're going to offend a lot of people. And this ad did offend a lot of people. And as it offended a lot of people, it did so not because they reject the idea that you shouldn't bully people. It offended them because it said that all men were bullies. And it said that their dads were bullies and that they, as dads, have been raising their kids wrong. And it's a very scolding and very condescending kind of message. And frankly, I think people on both sides of the political spectrum seem to understand this, because all my super left friends get it. They get the subtext, but they like it. Right? Because they sort of agree with it. They think that, men are kind of shitty and, need to be scolded and need to be better. Right? And then the sort of more right-wing crowd, the sort of more traditional masculinity crowd, is offended because they're being told that they're inherently bad. Right? It's only a small handful of my friends and the people that I know who are genuinely confused by what the ad is actually conveying. But I think it's a problem because I don't think they really fully understand what this ad is or what it's talking about. And thus, they're not really participating in the same conversations. They're not really talking about the same things. And so, like, one of the things people have been saying to me about this is that, oh, you just have no way of knowing that this was, this is an ad that's sort of pushing a broader and more extreme, like, there's no Bailey, right? Like, you have no way of knowing that this is pushing a anti-male or a super SJW kind of narrative. The problem is I actually do have ways to know that. First of all, it's clear throughout the video. It's clear in the subtext. It's clear in the word choice that they use at the beginning, but also both Procter & Gamble's chief brand officer, Mark Pritchard, and the advertising agency, Gray, and more importantly, the creative director, Kim Garrig, have all come right out and said that this is their goal. So, like, Kim Garrig, if you look at her other work, is not a fan of men. She did an ad in Australia, another kind of PSA like this, talking about gender roles and toxic masculinity. And the entire thing is a guy who's, like, working out in the gym and then goes home and beats the shit out of his son. Honestly, like, she's made it very clear where she stands on all this kind of stuff. And of course, it's It's right here. So look, the reason millions of people are seeing and responding to the subtext is because it's literally meant to be there. This isn't that big of a mystery. I don't think it's that big of a mystery, but I think a lot of people are confused. So, and frankly, that's fine, right? Like I don't have a problem with an ad having subtext or an ad staking out a position that's sort of extreme social activist left kind of ideology. We should just be able to acknowledge that that's what's there. And again, I think most of the people I'm talking to do acknowledge it. I'm just pulling from Marshall McLuhan here. Like, the medium is the message, right? Like, everything surrounding the ad, the context, the framing, the word choice, the image choices, the editing itself, right? Like, the showing the bad men and then showing the good men, all of this stuff is the message. The message is not just limited to the call to action, the text-based call to action at the end, right? You can't separate all of these things out. Like, they're all one thing. And the problem then is that even if they haven't explicitly staked out an extreme social justice activist perspective, Gillette has loudly identified themselves with it. None of these things should necessarily be political, but they are. They are tribal. They are political. Like, when you see #MeToo, that has a connotation. When you see toxic masculinity, that has a connotation. You know, maybe in the early days of the psychological literature around toxic masculinity, maybe that was limited to genuinely toxic behaviors, like super abusive behaviors, but it's not used in that context anymore. That word toxic masculinity is now used to describe any kind of behavior from like playing cops and robbers with your 5-year-old neighbor as a kid to like taking up slightly too much space on the subway. We've now gotten to a point where there are professors who are literally describing a phenomenon they call digital manspreading, and defining that as an aspect of toxic masculinity. So I think that the people who are upset about this video are not ignorant of any of that stuff. They know that social justice activists have a history of doxing people and deplatforming and trying to silence any kind of disagreement. They know that their position goes far beyond this sort of concern trolling, like, well, we just don't want to see the worst kinds of abuses. Like, it goes well into this territory of men are, and particularly white men, are fundamentally bad. And by the way, I mean, I don't want to get into this a whole lot, but you will notice that like pretty much all the bad men in this video are white, and a lot of the good men are not white, right? This is a choice that a director makes. This is a choice that a creative agency makes. These are all things that you choose to do as you are writing, casting, shooting, editing. All of these things are important. I think this is all ultimately where it comes to for me. I think that where people are confused is that if you don't see the subtext, if you don't look at this as a whole, and you don't take it in the context that it actually exists, and you only look at the individual examples, of course you're going to say, oh, well, there's nothing to complain about here. And then what happens is the people who don't understand this then are sort of forced to conclude that the only reason anybody would object to the ad is because they object to the literal content of the ad. They object to the idea that women shouldn't be sexually harassed on the street. But that's not what's happening. That's not why people don't like the video. And yeah, I think it's a lot of people. I honestly, if I had to bet, I think this is going to go, you know, I used the Paul Feig example before, and I think much in the way that Ghostbusters 2016 tanked really, really hard at the box office, I'm expecting Procter & Gamble to take a pretty big hit with Gillette on this. I could be wrong, but I think they went a lot too far on the audience that they were trying to target, and I think they assumed that their audience was a lot more accepting of the social justice narrative than their actual audience is. And that's why people don't like it. They can see the subtext screaming at them from a mile away, and they fit that subtext into what they already know of online social justice activism. And then also, I think more broadly, and maybe even much more simply, they don't like it because nobody likes being preached at, and nobody likes a condescending PSA. And you can make the case that this isn't really insulting the customers because it's really trying to make people feel like they should identify with the hero men in this. But the balance is all off. Like they're not making a heroic case for men. They're making a really terrible case for men with a small number of outliers who are the good guys. So it really comes across as like men suck. And people see that, and that's what they're actually responding to. To say that they're responding to this because they think rape is okay is just a poor conclusion. I think you should be on the lookout for things like this. Like these kind of Mott and Bailey arguments are used all the time. Like you'll have these arguments with people on Facebook and whatnot. So I think what's happening here with the Gillette ad is that people see the Bailey and they understand where the argument is actually being made, and they see how sort of offensive it is, and they really don't like that. They're not arguing against the Mott. They're not arguing against treating people well. So try not to straw man your friends. If you know somebody who like hates this ad, don't accuse them of supporting domestic abuse or sexual harassment. Like, that's not what this is about. Try to communicate with them on the grounds that they're actually communicating. So yeah, this has been my first, I guess, episode of Test Pattern, and hope you liked it and hope you learned something or got some value out of this, and I will see you later.